Yes, blind testing does make differences disappear. That's true. But probably not for the reasons that many of you think. As you've just seen, I receive hundreds, if not thousands of comments telling me that my impressions are invalid because they weren't formed under blind testing conditions. I also see hundreds of comments about the fact that blind listening tests conducted elsewhere have definitively shown that the differences between DACS, cables, sampling rates, and various other audio-related things don't exist. So let's see if we can put that to bed once and for all. I suspect this is a topic that's going to behave somewhat like a 4-year-old and be very difficult to put to bed, but let's try anyway. Are you ready? Let's start with a little game, and there's only one rule for this game, and that is you're not allowed to pause the video. Not for this bit anyway. I'm about to show you some images. Your job is to work out in each case if the first image and the second image are the same, or if one of them has been altered in some way. I'll keep rotating the images so you can see sample 1 and sample 2 multiple times before you make up your mind. Write in the comments down below if you think sample 1 or sample 2 has been altered, or if you think they're identical. And yes, we're using a visual medium for this test, but the same factors apply, as I'll explain soon. Here we go. Did you spot any differences? What's that you say? The images were different every single time? Yeah, they were. And so's music from moment to moment. They were also different in the sense that sample 2 had been altered or edited to be different from sample 1 in each case. Okay, so let's take the moment to moment variation out of this, which means we're no longer making it directly comparable to audio, but let's do it for the sake of the example. This time it's exactly the same image from sample 1 to sample 2. And on top of that, you already know that it has been altered. So this time, your task is to see what's changed. Remember, you're not allowed to pause the video because even though we're using the visual medium, we want to make this as close as possible to audio. And if you pause audio, the sound goes away. So you can't pause the video because if you pause the video, the visual stays. Audio doesn't behave like that. Are you ready? Let's see how many differences you can spot between sample 1 and sample 2. How did you go that time? Was it easier? Did you spot all the differences? Let's see. Could you tell that the treated version was a touch warmer in terms of its white balance? Did you see that I'd altered the colour balance so that the tone of some of the colours, some of the key colours, was a little bit different? Was it evident that I'd made the shadows just a little bit darker in the treated version? And did you see that the contrast had increased on the treated version? What about sharpness? Could you tell that the treated version was a little bit sharper than the untreated version? If you picked up on every single one of those changes without pausing the video, congratulations. However, I suspect I just congratulated exactly no one. And the reason for that is that there were just too many variables for you to account for in such short sample sizes. To see the white balance shift, you had to pay attention to a light or white part of the image at the center where the screens were. To see the deepening of the shadows, you had to pay attention to one of the corners of the image. To notice the color shift, you had to pay attention to one specific part of the image and stay locked onto that as the images changed. Even then, that's a hard one to see, as you're probably starting to realize there are just too many factors to process that quickly and to know where to allocate your attention for each cycle. And that is really the key, where to focus your attention. When we try to blind test audio products, we have exactly the same problem. What we're going to discuss today are the scientific, biological and neurological reasons that blind tests don't actually work for identifying the differences between audio products. To get this started though, let's talk about what this is and isn't about. Blind listening, where you audition a device without knowing how much it costs, what the device is, how great or not great it's meant to be, that approach is fantastic. That is not up for debate here because it does remove bias. It's not the only way to remove bias, but it is a good one. Instead of talking about blind auditioning, what we're talking about here today is blind A/B testing, and specifically the validity of blind A/B testing. In other words, is blind A/B testing a valid test of whether or not the listeners can reliably identify the differences or lack of differences between two devices? That type of a setup requires relatively rapid switching between option A, option B, and sometimes option X. X being either A or B repeated. As you've just seen, those rapid switches can be challenging, but that's how AB or ABX testing needs to work. And as people have correctly said in the comments, those tests almost always result in the listeners saying that there's no difference between the devices. Many will claim that that's evidence of the fact that there is no difference between the devices. What the science of hearing and perception and processing in our brains would say is that it's actually evidence of a perceptual and a processing bottleneck. Let me explain this further by starting at the broadest possible scale and then narrowing it down a bit. The sheer volume of information that our senses receive is overwhelming. Every movement of air against your eardrum, every single photon arriving at your retinas, every tiny point of pressure against your skin, every liquid chemical making contact with your taste buds, and every airborne chemical entering your nose. Your senses receive all of that information, but are you aware of it? Right now, before I said this, were you consciously aware of the contact points and the sense of the weight of your body on the chair where you're sitting, or maybe through the soles of your feet where you're standing? Were you aware before this moment of the lingering taste in your mouth and the last thing that you ate or drank? Hear that faint sound in the background of where you are right now? Let me pause for a moment so you can hear it. Were you aware of that before? Hopefully, this illustrates practically what the science tells us. Our brains are constantly filtering what we perceive from the vast ocean of possible inputs around us. It's been proposed that how we actually perceive the world is that our brain chooses when, where, and how to reach out via our senses to perceive what we need to and what we want to. The exact mechanisms of that aren't actually important here. What matters is that we understand how selective our perception is and has to be from one moment to the next. As you experienced just a few moments ago with the image tests, even using a single sense like sight or hearing can still present us with more inputs than we can take in a short amount of time. And that leads us to thinking about memory. Before we do though, I should mention that none of what I'm talking about here today is my own opinion or theory, unless I specifically say it is. Everything in this video has been drawn from reputable sources of scientific study, and the links or the titles are all provided for you in the description down below. Now, about memory. Our memories are formed in stages. When we pay attention to something, that input is stored in our short-term memory. Human short-term memory can hold roughly 4 pieces of information for about 15 seconds at a time. We sometimes cluster the information into chunks to help maximize the capacity. For instance, being able to remember a phrase means that we can remember one thing instead of all the individual words, which might overload our memory. The point here, though, is that our short-term memory isn't capable of storing the levels of complexity and the number of different variables that we experienced in that visual test before and that listeners experience in a short sample of music. I mean, just think about all the terms that we use to describe sound. One of the reasons that we use these terms, whether it's about audio or any other field of investigation, is to better cluster and chunk the information so that we can remember more of it in our short-term memory. After all, it's much easier to remember that a 15-second excerpt of music was upbeat, bright, jazzy, and featured a vocalist than to try to recall each specific note, the specific timbre of all the instruments and all the individual instruments at that, the time signature, which specific instruments were playing, and of course which parts each instrument was playing. That's just too much information. Of course, longer listening would yield all of that information, but not a 15-second excerpt. And that's because we can't work with the contents of our short-term memory in the same way that we can work with the contents of what's called our working memory and our long-term memory. Our working memory is a little bit like a bridge between the short-term and the long-term. It's the selection of neurons that are firing off in the brain as we pay attention to and analyze what's in the short-term memory, and it's what starts to transfer that into our long-term memory. Even once we've formed a long-term memory of something, for the first time at least, it's still a very basic picture of what we first experienced. It will continue to be refined and adjusted as we have continued exposure to whatever created that initial memory. This is a complex process that overlaps with our brain's use of what's called schemas to categorize and understand the world around us. Daniel Levitin discusses this in his book, Your Brain on Music, and he explains in there why you might struggle to listen to an unfamiliar style of music when you first hear it. But if you continue to listen to that style of music for a while, your brain will start to understand it. Your brain will develop schemas that tells it what's likely to come next in that sort of music, what rhythmic and melodic patterns you're likely to experience. It's also going to start understanding what's similar and different from the other types of music that you know. That's your brain working through complex comparisons between the sounds you're hearing now, the unfamiliar music, and the sounds you've heard before and gotten to know and understand in depth. As your brain builds more understanding, more schemas of that new unfamiliar music, you can then lean on those schemas as you experience more of that unfamiliar music, and now it's becoming more and more familiar, less and less foreign, and possibly more enjoyable as a result. It's no longer a complex confusion of sounds, it's now a dance that you're a part of. But that process takes time. It's why a deep appreciation of some genres can be difficult and take a long time for some people, or sometimes even be impossible. It's all about our brain building familiarity over time. So, what does all this have to do with blind listening tests? Well, as we've already said, blind listening tests designed to identify differences between two audio devices require the rapid switching back and forth to try to spot the differences, or at least to try to spot if there is a difference. That switching approach is essentially flooding your short-term memory with each sample of sound and allowing no time for the complex processing and understanding of those inputs before reflooding the short-term memory again. There's no time available for taking the short-term memory of the initial inputs and passing them and processing them through the working memory and into the long-term memory. In my experience, this leads us to start trying to use strategies to minimize the amount of information that we're trying to take in so as not to overwhelm the short-term memory. It leads us to focus on one aspect of the sound at a time, like the sound of a cymbal being hit or the positioning of a guitar in the soundstage. We do this to reduce the load on our perceptual systems. But it's really hard to understand the qualities of a forest by looking at a piece of bark on one of the trees. It's a bit like asking you to identify the differences between these two images. They're the same two from before, but if you happen to have selected to focus your attention on a part of the sound, or in this case the image, that's not particularly helpful in identifying what the differences are, you're going to struggle. The other common issue that I've found at least is that our brains don't tend to stay well focused on a single aspect. They tend to move around searching for understanding and cues that they can form their schemas from. Our brains are designed to compare the incoming information with the existing schemas and models that they already have. This allows us to form a better understanding of the world around us, but it results in an experience during something like a blind listening test that comes across a little bit more like this. Not particularly helpful, is it? I mean, it is helpful in helping us to understand the world around us. It's just not particularly helpful for blind testing because it's not what our bodies were designed to do. What's more, it can create errors in our perceptions, false positives or false negatives. That's because we're assessing a tiny part of the overall experience and drawing conclusions without having the full picture. And I mean picture in the figurative sense, not the literal sense. So, does this mean that all blind testing is completely useless? No, not at all. It just means that A/B tests requiring the switching between two different inputs where there are differences across multiple domains it means that those are not valid. What I mean by that is that two DACS, as a point of example, might have subtle differences in their sense of attack on transients, the sense of depth they produce in the soundstage, the amount of separation they can resolve between individual instruments, and maybe the sense of texture or resolution that they extract as well. Each of those differences is within a different domain: transient attack, soundstage depth, image separation, detail retrieval. And those are just a few examples of many, many more, like the sense of treble extension, the sense of clarity, tonal character, bass weight or impact, and treble quality. There are just too many variables, and the relatively rapid switching back and forth is overwhelming to our auditory systems. If you've been thinking about what I've been saying so far, you might already have a sense of the solution. It's an approach that Lund and Mackie-Vierter have referred to as slow listening in their AES reviewed paper. Basically, it means that to avoid the overload of our sensory and memory systems, we need to take more time to listen to and properly understand each individual audio device. Combining all that we know from sources like Lund and Mackie-Vierter, from Daniel Levitin's book, and from the meta-analysis by Milan Kunshaw that I talked about in my recent video called The Secret to Wonderful Sound, slow listening provides a few important opportunities. Firstly, it gives our minds time to shuffle around the music and gain all the insights that we need to properly understand what we're hearing. It gives us time to consider all of those different domains: space, imaging, tonality, timbral qualities, dynamics, and probably more. Secondly, it gives us time to think about what we're hearing and to transfer those inputs from our short-term memory through our working memory and into our long-term memory. We also have time to compare and contrast our perceptions with what we're still hearing from that same device to further refine those understandings we've created in our long-term memory. It's like we begin with a very rough sketch of what we've heard. The brain then revisits our perceptions and strengthens the connections, and I'm talking about neuronal connections here. It strengthens the connections that support our understanding of what we're hearing, and it prunes away the ones that maybe weren't quite so accurate at first. Over time, we go from something that resembles a mental sketch to something more akin to a mental high-definition image of whatever the memory or whatever the perception was. And this is probably a good time to note that this is why a solution to A/B testing is not to just expand the time between each swap to a 1-minute section. By expanding the time to about a minute, we're still not giving our brains and our processing systems sufficient time to properly understand what we're hearing. Instead, it needs to be multiple listens to multiple tracks on option 1 and multiple listens to multiple tracks on option 2. And there's another part that we haven't talked about yet. The final thing that slow listening allows us to do is to experience the emotions of the music. Our emotions play a large part in more deeply embedding the memories that we form, whether it's to do with audio or any other type of perception. And so allowing ourselves to experience the emotions of the music through each device will actually strengthen our understanding and our memories of what each of those devices was delivering to the music. But here's another little theory. My experiences testing gear over the years, and it's been many, many years now, would suggest that the slow listening approach also overcomes unconscious bias. Yes, blind listening tests do remove any chance of unconscious bias, and you can do blind slow listening. For example, having somebody else connect the gear so that you don't know which DAC goes to which input, or which cables are making the connections. Sometimes though, that's not feasible. As a solo reviewer, I don't have somebody here that I can get to do the cable and connection changes whenever I want them to. What I've found instead though, is that any unconscious biases that I have are always strongest in the first few moments of listening. After 30 minutes or an hour, or most often a few days of listening, I no longer have any biases at play. My personal experiences of unconscious bias is that it makes me pay attention to the things that I think are going to be better or worse between two devices. A bit like the selective attention examples from earlier. With slow listening, our minds are free to wander wherever they want to, and they do. With slow listening, we are also inevitably moved or unmoved emotionally by what we're listening to, and that's an unconscious process. Any initial unconscious bias fades away in the light of a real emotional experience. Be they good or bad. Devices I expected to love, like the XD05 Pro, where I started with a positive bias towards it, failed to stir my emotions over extended listening sessions in the same way that the Chord Mojo 2 does. I still love the XD05 Pro because of its features and its interface, but there was no way I could deny that the Mojo 2 was the more emotionally engaging device. And all of this now brings us back to where A/B testing is actually really valuable. After slow listening tests have helped you to understand which device is preferable to you, quick A/B tests between known products helps us to understand the why. It helps us to extract the specific differences that make product A preferable or product B preferable. By this point, our brains have developed detailed and complex schemas and models to understand each device. We're familiar with both devices intimately now. I mean, not intimately. We now understand the nature of the whole forest, and so we now can look at an individual piece of bark on an individual tree and draw meaning from it, or how the sunlight breaches the canopy in the forest, or the specific way that the leaves are scattered on the ground. Individually, none of those things describe the forest, but they do help us to understand why we experience two different forests differently. Hopefully I didn't go too far on the tree analogy there. And so there's just one thing that I haven't addressed yet, and we're nearly done. You might be thinking that I'm saying that slow listening will always reveal differences between two products, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there are no discernible differences between two different products. I've had a number of past reviews where I've stated in the review that I couldn't really tell the products apart by their sound. Sometimes there's maybe a difference, but it's small enough to be insignificant or indistinguishable. In other words, after doing the slow listening to form my mental schemas and models and a deep understanding, and then doing A/B testing between them, some products are just the same. The point here is, for me, I would only trust someone else's impressions or my impressions after they'd spent an extended amount of time slow listening to the product. Short bursts of auditioning and comparison are simply too much for our auditory systems to process. And it doesn't matter how the test is set up, it's purely a question of time and removing the need to focus on specific differences and therefore that very focused attention requirement. Now that we've reached this point, you'll probably want to watch this video next, because this one explains why most of the measurements used in hi-fi marketing and in most hi-fi reviews actually don't tell us anything that we really need to know to properly understand the products. And so check that one out now. But for now, thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy slow listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.